Danish foraging parties sent downstream met Curonian ambushers who knew every trail, stream, and hiding place with intimate familiarity. King Horik ordered his ships to raid farther along the river for supplies, not realizing he was sending them into prepared traps. Day 5 witnessed religious desperation that would haunt Swedish warriors for generations and reveal the depth of their psychological collapse. King Olaf, watching his army systematically bleeding out against unstormable walls, made a decision that shocked his pagan warriors to their core. He abandoned the Norse gods and prayed to the Christian God for divine intervention. Swedish soldiers watching their king kneel in the bloody mud before a wooden cross felt their entire worldview shifting beneath them. Think about the psychological significance of that moment. A Viking king praying to his enemy's god because his own gods, Odin, Thor, Freya, had completely abandoned him to die in Baltic mud. The archaeological evidence reveals something shocking about this spiritual desperation. Excavations at Outplayed found Christian symbols mixed with pagan offerings, Vikings desperately invoking any divine aid from any source. But Curonian defenders had their own gods, Baltic deities of war and death, who demanded enemy blood as offerings. The spiritual battle paralleled the physical one, and Vikings were catastrophically losing both. Swedish morale collapse indicators multiplied exponentially. Soldiers openly refused night watch duty, terrified of Curonian raiders who killed silently in darkness. Wounded men begged comrades for quick deaths rather than lingering agony. Veterans who had survived campaigns across Europe spoke openly of retreat and abandoning the siege. Military organization dissolved into desperate individual survival instinct. Night raids intensified with almost supernatural precision. Curonians struck repeatedly where Vikings were weakest, isolated sentries, exposed supply lines, vulnerable horse pickets. Fire arrows turned the siege camp into an inferno of burning tents and panicking men. Every successful raid emboldened defenders while further demoralizing attackers in cascading psychological effect. The warfare reached psychological crescendo when Curonian warriors began throwing Swedish heads from the walls while singing battle hymns in their language. What happened next enters the realm of battlefield psychological breakdown. Swedish priests reported visions of Curonian gods walking the ramparts. Danish warriors swore they saw their own dead comrades fighting alongside fortress defenders. Whether genuine supernatural terror or exhaustion-induced hallucination, the psychological effect was devastatingly real. Vikings feared these walls held more than mortal enemies. They faced something that defied their understanding of warfare. By day 8, the tactical situation had reversed completely. Vikings weren't besieging anymore. They were trapped. Curonian raids had systematically destroyed all supply trains stretching back through hostile territory. Danish ships stationed downstream had stopped responding to signals. Swedish cavalry sent to investigate their silence never returned. The fortress had become a magnet, drawing Vikings inexorably to their doom. Every dead Viking created 2 Baltic raiders, eager for revenge against generations of oppression. King Olaf faced ultimate reality with royal desperation and no good options. His army couldn't take Outplayed through assault. They couldn't maintain the siege without supplies. They might not even retreat successfully through hostile territory. Traditional Viking warfare had met its absolute master in defenders who understood every tactic and countered with superior discipline and preparation. Swedish prayers to Christ offered no more divine aid than abandoned Odin. King Olaf made his final desperate choice, one last suicidal assault. He gathered his remaining champions, berserkers who had sworn to die rather than retreat in shame. These weren't soldiers anymore seeking victory, but men seeking glorious death over shameful survival. They painted their shields black, marking themselves for Valhalla. 8,000 Swedes advanced in pre-dawn darkness. They had learned from previous catastrophic failures. No packed formations for Curonian javelins to shatter. no predictable approaches for defenders to target with prepared traps. Instead, they came in scattered groups, each seeking its own path through the killing grounds. Some carried ladders, others bore hooks and ropes, all expected to die, achieving nothing. Then the fortress gates opened, not in surrender as exhausted Vikings briefly hoped, but in something far more terrifying. Curonian warriors poured out in perfect, disciplined formation, shields locked in testudo, spears leveled at identical angles. This wasn't the chaotic charge Vikings expected from defenders. This was disciplined, calculated aggression by warriors who had spent 8 days studying Viking tactics and preparing the perfect counter-response. Behind the infantry came Curonian cavalry on small, fast horses that danced through mud where Swedish war horses floundered helplessly. The trap's sophistication became horrifyingly clear within minutes. Curonians had planned this false retreat for days, studying exactly where Viking discipline would break, where pursuit instinct would override tactical sense. They had even prepared the ground itself. What looked like solid earth was actually bog covered with branches and thin layers of soil. As Vikings pursued the seemingly fleeing defenders deeper into prepared killing zones, they rushed into catastrophe. 1,000 Swedish warriors died in 10 minutes. The statistics barely capture the systematic slaughter. Swedish berserkers charging ahead of their supports found themselves isolated and surrounded by coordinated Curonian spear formations. Curonian warriors worked with mechanical efficiency, stabbing at legs and groins where armor was weakest. When Vikings fell in the mud, auxiliary troops with clubs ensured they never rose again. The muddy ground became an abattoir of Swedish ambitions, drowning in blood and broken bodies. Remember the crucial distinction. These weren't professional soldiers meeting disciplined resistance. These were Viking warriors raised on tales of individual glory and heroic single combat, facing an enemy that fought as a single coordinated organism. Every Curonian knew their specific role. Every movement followed rehearsed tactical patterns. When Swedish champions sought honorable single combat for glory, they met coordinated killing teams of 3 to 5 warriors. Where Vikings expected honorable battle following their cultural rules, they found systematic extermination following Curonian rules perfected over decades. The false retreat continued with horrific precision across the killing grounds. Curonian forces pulled back in stages, each withdrawal drawing Vikings deeper into prepared positions marked by hidden stakes. Side channels suddenly filled with Baltic warriors who had waited in perfect concealment. What seemed like imminent victory became complete encirclement. The screams of trapped Swedes echoed across the battlefield, but their comrades couldn't help. They were fighting desperately for their own lives. King Olaf himself led a suicidal charge to save his trapped vanguard. His household warriors, the finest in Sweden, carved a temporarily bloody path toward surrounded comrades. For a brief moment, Viking fury seemed to prevail through sheer desperation. Swedish axes split Curonian shields. Royal guardsmen fought with strength born of knowing they faced death either way. Then came the moment Vikings feared most. Curonian reserves struck both flanks simultaneously in perfectly coordinated assault. The Swedish retreat began as organized withdrawal and ended as panicked flight within minutes. Unit cohesion shattered completely. Officers couldn't maintain any control. Individual warriors threw away weapons and armor to run faster through the mud. But Curonians had prepared for this phase too. Fresh troops waited along all retreat routes. Mounted archers harried fleeing Vikings. Every 100 meters of retreat cost 50 Viking lives. What happened next would haunt Swedish survivors for generations. Curonian pursuit wasn't random violence but systematic destruction following prepared plans. They targeted officers first, breaking command structure completely. They crippled horses, forcing mounted warriors to fight on foot where they were vulnerable. They set fires to channel fleeing Vikings into additional killing grounds. This wasn't battle anymore. It was extermination executed with terrible industrial efficiency. King Olaf's leadership crumbled with his dying army. Surrounded by his last guardsmen, abandoned by fleeing troops, he faced the ultimate Viking nightmare: death without glory or honor. Curonian warriors closed in not as honorable opponents offering single combat, but as efficient executioners. The Swedish king, who had desperately prayed to Christ, died calling on Odin. His crown, symbol of Swedish power, vanished into Curonian hands as trophy. Meanwhile, the Danish force, anchored downstream, faced its own catastrophe. Word of Swedish collapse reached King Horik's ships just as Curonian war vessels appeared on the river in coordinated attack. These weren't the trading boats Danes had contemptuously expected, but war galleys specifically designed for ramming and boarding in river combat. Shallow draft construction allowed them to navigate channels where Danish longships grounded helplessly. What followed wasn't naval battle, but maritime massacre. Earlier in the siege, Danish raiders had sailed downstream seeking easier targets than Apuale's walls. They found Grobina, seemingly wealthy and apparently defenseless. Ships loaded with plunder, anchored in the river, crews celebrating their easy success. But this had been a trap within the larger trap. Curonian defenders had deliberately evacuated valuables before Danish arrival, leaving just enough treasure to fill Viking ships with heavy plunder that would slow them fatally. Now overladen with loot and sluggish in narrow waters, those Danish ships couldn't maneuver when Baltic war vessels struck like wolves among sheep. Curonian crews, experts in river warfare, who had studied Viking naval tactics for generations, turned Danish advantages into fatal weaknesses. The Curonians weren't defending their shores anymore. They had become hunters, and Vikings were prey, drowning in their own greed. Danish ships desperately tried forming defensive circles with shields out and spears bristling in classic formation. But Curonian fire arrows turned wooden vessels into floating pyres. When Vikings abandoned burning ships, Baltic warriors waited in the shallows with spears and axes, methodically killing survivors as they struggled through water. The loss of accumulated plunder meant more than material disaster for Danish economics. Viking armies traditionally funded themselves entirely through plunder and tribute. Without captured treasure, survivors couldn't pay their crews or replace lost equipment. Every chest of silver sinking in the Venta River meant Danish military power diminishing. Curonian divers would recover this treasure later, funding future revenge raids on Scandinavian coasts with Viking silver. The economic reversal matched the military one perfectly. The pursuit phase reached crescendo at the river mouth. Danish ships racing desperately for open sea found the exit blocked. Curonian vessels had created an impassable barrier of burning boats and deliberately sunken hulls. Behind them on both shores, Baltic warriors waited with bows and spears. The trap was geometrically perfect. No escape by water, no survival on land, no hope remaining. King Horik faced the unthinkable for a Viking ruler. His force, the pride of Denmark, was being systematically destroyed. His kingdom's greatest warriors were dying in foreign mud and river water. His treasury was sinking in Baltic depths. Traditional Viking honor demanded death before surrender, but cold pragmatism suggested survival might serve Denmark better than noble death. The final Danish humiliation came with Sunrise Revelation. Curonian chiefs offered terms that reversed 5 centuries of Viking dominance with brutal clarity. Denmark would pay tribute of 30 pounds of silver annually. Danish ships would seek permission before entering Baltic waters. Most humiliatingly, Denmark would provide hostages from noble families as guarantee. The terrorizers had become tribute payers overnight. The siege ended, but real terror was beginning. Survivors would carry tales of Curonian invincibility across Scandinavia. Every Viking mother would learn new prayers, not for successful raids, but for protection from Baltic vengeance. The hunters had become prey. Dawn revealed catastrophe's full scope: nearly 10,000 Viking corpses in chainmail. 1 in 3 warriors who marched on Apuale would never return. They'd lost the aura of invincibility that made Viking expansion possible. Every dead Viking created two Baltic raiders. Within months, revenge raids struck Swedish coasts. Blekinge burned as Curonians applied Viking tactics with improvements. The irony was excruciating. Swedish warriors were dying at Apual when Baltic raiders burned their homes. For 300 years afterward, Baltic peoples controlled the Eastern Sea. The terror culminated in 1187 when combined Baltic forces sailed up Swedish rivers and sacked Sigtuna, Sweden's holy capital 60 kilometers inland. They burned churches built with Eastern plunder, killed the archbishop, destroyed the city. Stockholm was founded specifically as fortified response to this permanent Baltic threat. Viking expansion died at Apuole in Lithuanian mud. When warriors pray to enemy gods and pay tribute to former victims, psychological dominance shifts forever. Subscribe to Great History for more battles where victims became victors through superior tactics.